Every single day, something invisible is being taken from you. Not your money, not your schedule, not your possessions, but something far more essential than any of these. And most people never notice it vanishing until it is almost gone. We speak endlessly about managing our finances, our calendars, our relationships. We optimize our routines and track our habits. Yet there is one resource that most people hemorrhage freely and recklessly, barely noticing the drain. And that resource is the silent foundation beneath everything we call a meaningful life. Without it, ambition collapses into anxiety. Relationships curdle from connection into obligation. Days blur together until they feel less like living and more like simply enduring. That resource is your inner energy, your focused, deliberate presence. And the ancient Stoics understood something about it that the modern world, despite all its sophistication, has entirely forgotten. Marcus Aurelius ruled the most powerful empire that had ever existed, managing wars, plagues, political betrayals, and the weight of decisions that affected millions of lives. And yet, what he returned to in his private writings, the journal he never intended for public eyes, was not strategy or conquest. It was one single discipline, the protection of his own mind's clarity and sovereignty. He reminded himself repeatedly that his judgments, his inner responses, his allocation of attention, these were his fortress. No person or circumstance could breach them without his consent. And the management of that fortress was the only task that genuinely mattered. What would your life look like if your attention truly belonged to you? Consider what it actually feels like to walk away from a conversation completely intact, not emotionally numb, but genuinely untouched in your reserves. The difference is important. Untouched means that whatever the exchange required, it was given willingly and from genuine surplus. Your focus is where you left it. Your sense of self is undisturbed. Your inner landscape is exactly as you maintained it before the interaction began. That feeling, quiet, rare, almost foreign in the modern context, is not accidental. It is not a personality trait you either possess or lack. It is the product of a practice so ancient that it predates almost every philosophical tradition we still celebrate. The Stoics describe the mind as a citadel, not a closed room, but a sovereign space that engaged with the world from a position of stability rather than being swept about by it. This citadel is not built from indifference. It is built from awareness, from deliberate choice, from the practiced ability to distinguish between what the world is presenting to you and what you are deciding to do with it. These are not the same thing. The space between them is where your life is actually being lived. That space, and the recognition that it exists, is the beginning of everything. Here is the word that changes everything when you apply it honestly to the question of energy: finite. Your mental, emotional, and spiritual energy does not replenish automatically or infinitely on demand. It cannot be borrowed from a future self who will somehow be less tired. It cannot be stockpiled from periods of rest and deployed indefinitely. Every interaction you enter, every expectation you silently absorb, every obligation you accept without pausing to evaluate it, each of these draws from the same limited account. A single withdrawal may be negligible, but spend carelessly long enough, and one morning, you wake to find the account nearly empty, and you cannot immediately trace when the depletion began. This is the particular danger of energy loss. It does not announce itself with clarity. It creeps. It compounds slowly, invisibly, beneath the threshold of conscious notice. By the time you recognize genuine exhaustion, not tiredness, but the deep kind, where something essential in you feels slightly out of reach, the depletion has been accumulating for far longer than you realize. The fog settling into your thinking, the patience that shortened without your permission, the sense that even decisions you would normally make without effort, suddenly carry unreasonable weight. These are not character flaws. They are receipts, evidence of expenditure that was never tracked and therefore never questioned. Here is what the Stoics would say to you at this moment. The problem is not that the world demands too much. The problem is that you have not yet decided what the world is permitted to take. Your energy is not a gift owed to the world. It is the currency of your own life. Imagine the invisible economy of a single, ordinary day. You wake with a certain capacity. Call it a full account of inner presence. A restless night of half-formed anxieties has already spent a portion before you have risen from bed. A tense exchange over breakfast costs more. An inbox that breeds low-grade unease costs something even while you delay opening it. A phone call with someone whose company leaves you feeling vaguely hollow. That costs steadily through every minute you remain engaged. An afternoon meeting that should have been a message. A favor accepted more from guilt than genuine willingness. By midday, many people are operating at a significant deficit they cannot name, wondering why the simplest decisions feel disproportionately hard. Seneca observed, writing from his own experience of exhaustion and political turmoil, that the greatest thief of a life was not an enemy, not illness, not failure or misfortune. It was distraction, the scattered, unguarded attention that is given to everything and therefore belongs to nothing. He wrote that we do not have a short time to live. We waste much of what we have. Apply this directly to energy. The problem is rarely that we possess too little. It is that we dispense it without thought, without evaluation, without the basic question of whether what we are giving it to genuinely deserves it. What, then, is the correction? Not retreat, not the fantasy of withdrawing from all complexity and demand. The correction is discernment. Discernment is the practice of seeing clearly before moving, of creating enough interior space between a demand and your response to honestly ask, does this deserve what I am about to give it? Is this obligation, this conversation, this expectation worthy of the presence it will cost me today? These questions do not arise from selfishness. They arise from responsibility. Responsibility to yourself and, by direct extension, to every person and purpose you genuinely wish to serve with excellence. Because here is the paradox the Stoics understood entirely. The person who gives without discernment ends up giving poorly. The parent who cannot say no to interruption is rarely genuinely present to their children. The professional who accepts every meeting cannot bring their best thinking to the ones that actually require it. Saying yes without evaluation is not generosity. It is a way of avoiding the harder discipline of deciding what actually matters and then acting accordingly. And what actually matters is the entire question, is it not? The Stoic tradition is built on a foundational distinction that sounds simple and proves endlessly difficult to actually practice. The difference between what lies within your control and what does not. External circumstances, the behavior of others, the expectations that culture and profession project onto you. These are not within your control. Your response, your allocation of attention, your judgment about where to direct your genuine presence, these are. This is not a philosophy of passivity or detachment. It is a philosophy of precision. By releasing the compulsion to manage what cannot be managed, you free enormous reserves of energy for what genuinely can be. Consider how much presence the average person surrenders to entirely uncontrollable territory. The replaying of a conversation from days ago, listening for the wrong note you might have struck, the preemptive rehearsal of a confrontation that may never come, the background hum of imagined judgments, assessments that exist only in your own mind, constructed from speculation rather than evidence. All of this costs. All of this draws from the same account, and none of it produces anything of value. Only more fatigue, which produces more reactive decisions, which produce more situations requiring recovery. The alternative is not indifference. The mind that has genuinely learned the boundary between what is and is not within its jurisdiction does not stop caring about the world. It stops bleeding for things that were never within its power to alter. It directs its available presence toward purposeful engagement, toward conversations that build something real, toward work that moves toward meaningful outcomes, toward relationships that restore rather than steadily deplete. This is not coldness. It is the highest form of committed engagement, fully present because the energy required for that presence was protected rather than scattered. The mind that guards its limits can give without limit where giving truly counts. Let us speak specifically about relationships, because this is where the question of energy becomes most personal and most frequently avoided. We know, even when we do not say so, that some people leave us feeling subtly more alive after contact with them. The conversation ends and something in us is cleaner, more oriented, more capable. Other exchanges produce precisely the opposite result. We leave feeling slightly diminished, as if something was quietly drawn from us that we did not consciously offer. Neither person may be fully aware of this transaction. This is rarely about deliberate manipulation or conscious selfishness. It is about alignment, reciprocity, and the direction in which energy moves within a particular dynamic, and whether that direction is serving both people or primarily one. Epictetus, who had been enslaved, who had lost almost every material possession a person can possess, understood relationships with a clarity that comfort rarely produces. He did not advise the avoidance of difficult people or challenging connections. He advised something far more useful: philosophical preparation, entering each significant relationship with eyes genuinely open, with expectations calibrated to reality rather than hope, and with the inner citadel maintained regardless of what the exchange presents. What does that look like in practice? It means honestly assessing, before you arrive at a demanding interaction, what your current level of reserves actually is. It means recognizing that attempting to give generously from an already depleted state is not kindness. It is performance. The gesture may look like presence, but it costs from reserves that were already stressed, and it produces the kind of hollow, distracted engagement that the other person will sense even when they cannot name it. There is a category of relationship deserving particular examination, not the obviously damaging ones, which are usually easier to recognize and name, but the subtly draining ones. The person who makes contact primarily to process their own experience, leaving no space for yours to exist. The acquaintance whose conversations orbit entirely around their own concerns, with no evident curiosity about anything beyond that orbit. The friend who responds to any assertion of your limits with disappointment calibrated to produce guilt, not maliciously, but effectively. These are not villains. They are people navigating their own depletion without awareness, seeking what they need in directions where it genuinely cannot be found. The energetic cost to you is real regardless of their intentions. The Stoic wisdom here is not to condemn or abandon these people in moments of frustration. It is to see clearly, without the distortion of either idealization or resentment, what the dynamic actually is, and to make considered choices about engagement accordingly. The uncomfortable truth beneath that examination is this: the reason many draining relationships persist is rarely an absence of courage. It is that we have confused compliance with compassion. We have absorbed, often from very early in our lives, the belief that withholding attention or redirecting energy constitutes a form of moral failure. That the person of genuine virtue always answers, always accommodates, always finds one more reserve to offer. This belief is not kindness. It is a story. And like all stories, it is worth questioning before accepting as permanent. Real compassion is not equivalent to unlimited availability. A physician who never rests makes more errors. A teacher who never reflects gives progressively worse instruction. A friend who never protects their own presence eventually becomes incapable of offering genuine presence to anyone. The protection of your energy is not ultimately a personal indulgence. It is the precondition for sustained, authentic contribution. You cannot keep pouring from what you have already emptied, no matter how sincere the intention behind the gesture. Marcus Aurelius practiced what he called his morning preparation, a deliberate act of preemptive clarity undertaken before the day's demands had any opportunity to shape his internal posture for him. Before requests arrived and obligations accumulated, he reminded himself of what he valued, what he controlled, and what he intended to hold on to in the face of whatever the day brought. This was not pessimism, it was not resignation. It was armor, the conscious construction of a stable inner orientation before the world had its chance to construct one through pressure and default. That practice is available to you today, not as a philosophical ceremony, but as a practical discipline that measurably changes the quality of every interaction, decision, and moment of creative effort that follows it. What would it mean to begin each day? Not by immediately surrendering your attention to the notifications and messages and demands of other people's agendas, but by first deciding quietly and specifically where your energy genuinely belongs today. Not as an act of defensiveness, not from fear, but from the calm authority of someone who has honestly assessed what they carry and what they can afford to give, and who has decided in advance rather than by reflex. This is what we might call the architecture of intentional living, and its foundation is not a dramatic restructuring of your circumstances. It is a single disciplined act repeated consistently enough to become instinctive. The pause before the yes, the pause before the response to the message that produced an immediate emotional reaction, the pause before accepting an obligation. Your body is already quietly declining before your mind has had time to arrive at the same conclusion. The Stoics called this practice prosoj, watchfulness, sustained attention to your own internal state. Not obsessive self-focus, but honest, grounded awareness. The kind that notices the contraction that arises when a request conflicts with something you genuinely need. The kind that can distinguish between discomfort that signals growth and discomfort that signals a violation of something essential. Most of us have been conditioned to override that signal immediately. The moment we sense even the beginning of a no, something in us rushes to correct it. You will disappoint them. You will seem selfish. You owe them this. Someone of genuine character would say yes without hesitation, and so the signal is suppressed. The yes is delivered on schedule, and somewhere in the invisible account, another withdrawal is processed without record. What if instead you simply paused, not indefinitely, not as a strategy of avoidance, just long enough to hear the signal, evaluate it without the distortion of social fear, and then decide from a genuine place of agency rather than reflex? The pause changes the entire nature of the exchange. An automatic yes is a surrender of agency. A considered yes, even if the content of the answer is identical, is an act of conscious choice. The person receiving your answer cannot perceive the difference, but you live the difference entirely. One depletes from below the threshold of awareness. The other empowers because it came from somewhere genuine rather than somewhere pressured. This is the practice the Stoics meant by self-mastery, not the suppression of feeling or the performance of blank indifference, but the cultivation of enough interior space to choose responses rather than simply generate them. Now let us go deeper into territory that is often left unexamined, the internal drains. the ones that do not require any external person, request, or obligation to operate. The ones that run entirely on their own momentum within the landscape of your own mind. Anxiety is perhaps the most prolific silent thief of presence that exists, and not the dramatic identifiable variety that announces itself clearly, but the chronic low-grade hum that runs beneath conscious awareness for hours, sometimes across entire days. The mind rehearsing conversations that have not happened and may never happen, constructing catastrophic extensions from partial information, monitoring and remonitoring the impressions you may have made in rooms you left hours ago. None of this produces anything of practical value. All of it costs from the same finite account. And the cost is not confined to the moment. It is cumulative, creating a baseline of cognitive fatigue that colors every subsequent decision and interaction the day produces. The Stoics were among the first thinkers to map this territory explicitly. What they observed was that most suffering does not arise from the event itself, but from the story the mind constructs around the event. The interpretations applied, the catastrophic projections, the narrative of personal significance woven around what is, at root, a neutral occurrence. A message goes unanswered for several hours. The event itself, neutral. The mind's elaboration of that fact, potentially consuming hours of presence in speculation and imagined meaning. The exhaustion produced is entirely real, regardless of the fact that the underlying event has still not changed. The Stoic practice here is not to pretend these thoughts do not arise. It is to examine them when they do, to bring them into the light of honest attention and ask, is this thought producing anything of value? Is it solving something, clarifying something, genuinely preparing me for something real? Or is it simply consuming energy that belongs elsewhere? This examination was central to Marcus Aurelius's daily practice and to the practice of every significant Stoic teacher. It is not natural at first. The mind has been permitted to run largely unmonitored for most of our lives. The habit of unconscious consumption, by imagined obligation, imagined judgment, imagined threat, is deeply established. Interrupting it requires deliberate practice, and it will not remain interrupted perfectly even after the practice is well established. But it is interruptible, and each interruption is a genuine reclamation. A comparison deserves specific attention here because it is one of the most potent internal drains operating in the contemporary context. We inhabit an environment that is architecturally designed to trigger comparison. Curated presentations of other lives, other achievements, other appearances, flowing continuously through devices that almost never leave our hands. Each exposure may be individually minor. The cumulative effect across hours and days and years is a persistent tax on contentment, on clarity about what genuinely matters to you, and on the energy available for actually building it. Epictetus addressed this with characteristic directness. The question of whether someone else is further along, more accomplished, or more admired is not your question. It is a borrowed question. It measures you against a framework you did not construct, towards standards that were not derived from your values. The energy spent inside that borrowed framework is energy entirely unavailable for the actual life you are attempting to build. Every unit of presence given to comparison is a unit withdrawn from creation. Carl Jung, arriving centuries after the Stoics, but at profoundly resonant conclusions, observed that what we refuse to make conscious will direct our lives, and we will mistake that direction for fate. The habit of comparison, the compulsion to accommodate others at the expense of self, the inability to maintain clarity under the pressure of other people's expectations. These are not innate character flaws. They are patterns. And patterns, once genuinely seen, become available for interruption. The seeing is itself a form of power, Journaling, simple, unglamorous, and profoundly underestimated, is among the most reliable instruments for this kind of pattern recognition. When you write honestly about where your energy went during a given day, what surprised you in its cost, what drained you that you had not anticipated, you begin to see the actual architecture of your own depletion. Patterns surface that were entirely invisible in real time. The recurring situations, the habitual reflexes, the self-imposed pressures that appear again and again in your account of where presence actually went. Observation alone does not produce change, but it is the necessary precondition for it. Without honest observation, nothing is available to change, because nothing specific has been identified. With it, something becomes genuinely possible that was previously foreclosed: the choice. You can ask with actual evidence behind the question, is this where I want my presence to go? And if the answer is no, you can begin, deliberately, consistently, without drama, to redirect. This redirection is what the Stoics described as living according to reason, according to the genuine values and considered priorities of the individual, rather than the accumulated momentum of habit, expectation, and social pressure that typically shapes a life by default. It is not a rejection of the world. It is the insistence on being genuinely present within it, rather than performing presence while operating on reserves that were spent hours ago. Boundaries are often the most resisted concept in this territory of self-mastery, in part because the word itself has been so thoroughly misunderstood. A boundary is not a wall. It is not a rejection of another person. It is not the architecture of someone cold or difficult or withdrawn. A boundary is a clear declaration, quiet, firm, and maintained consistently, about what you are genuinely able and willing to offer from a place of authentic surplus. It is the difference between engagement that is real and engagement that is elaborately performed. The confusion around limits arises because we have largely absorbed the equation between availability and affection. If you genuinely care about someone, the unspoken belief insists you are always available to them. If your work matters to you, you will always find the reserve to meet its demands. If you are a person of genuine character, a no reasonable request will reach you without a yes attached. These beliefs are so deeply embedded that asserting a limit can feel internally like a moral failure, even when the alternative is continuing to give from a place of genuine depletion. Examine the logic, though. A person who is genuinely depleted cannot give genuinely. The interaction that occurs when you say yes while your reserves are already stressed is not presence. It is performance. And performance, however skillful, is not what the people in your life actually need from you. They need what only real presence delivers: authentic attention, genuine response, the felt sense that you are actually here with them and not merely appearing to be. A boundary, understood this way, is not a withdrawal of care. It is the protection of your capacity to care. It is the assertion that your presence has value that is diminished rather than enhanced by being given indiscriminately. Saying clearly what you can and cannot offer is not selfishness. It is integrity between your intention and your actual capacity. Epictetus taught that freedom is not the absence of constraint, but the mastery of the self within whatever constraints exist. Applied to energy, this means freedom is not the elimination of obligation. It is the deliberate relationship with obligation, the considered selection of which demands genuinely align with your values, and the willingness to communicate that alignment honestly rather than performing compliance that your internal state has already rejected. The courage this requires should not be minimized. Asserting a limit with someone accustomed to your automatic availability will typically produce discomfort in them and in you. Their discomfort is their process. It is not yours to prevent by rescinding the limit. Your own discomfort deserves examination. Ask yourself honestly, is this discomfort evidence that the limit is genuinely wrong? Or is it evidence that you are interrupting a pattern that has long needed interrupting, and that the interruption itself is uncomfortable precisely because it is unfamiliar? Most often, it is the latter. And here is something important to hold, something that is genuinely difficult to trust without direct experience of it. Other people, in most cases, adjust. The relationship that initially appeared threatened by your limit frequently becomes more honest, more balanced, a more genuinely mutual after the limit has been maintained, because the foundation of the exchange has shifted from assumed availability to actual consent, from performed generosity to real generosity, and real generosity offered from genuine surplus rather than forced compliance carries a quality that performance cannot replicate, and that the people who receive it can feel even when they cannot articulate what has changed. Now consider the dimension of energy management that extends across time, not just the single conversation or single day, but the way the choices you make consistently shape the capacity available to you weeks and months from now. Habitual overextension does not merely cost in each individual moment, it establishes a new baseline for what normal feels like. When sustained depletion becomes the default state, the perception of what is manageable shifts downward, and you begin to operate at diminished capacity without recognizing the reduction, because the reduction has become your new reference point. This is how people arrive at a place where everything feels hard, where even small decisions require unreasonable effort, and where they cannot identify when or how they reached this state. Recovery, genuine recovery, not merely the cessation of effort, but the deliberate restoration of depleted reserves, is not an indulgence. It is an operational requirement for anyone serious about the quality of their engagement over any meaningful period of time. Marcus Aurelius recognized that the subtle signs of an overtaxed mind, the shortened patience, the reactive decisions, the irritability that surprises even the person experiencing it, were not character flaws to suppress, but signals to honor. What restoration looks like will vary by person and circumstance. The consistent thread across Stoic practice is deliberate stillness, the intentional creation of space in which the mind is not producing, accommodating, or performing. The morning practice before external demands arrive. The walk that is genuinely a walk, not a mobile office. The reading that invites reflection rather than requiring output. Physical movement that returns attention to the body and releases the accumulated tension of relentless cognitive engagement. These practices are not additions to the important work of life. They are what makes the important work of life sustainable over the long arc. The weekly audit is a practice of navigation rather than judgment, a simple, regular, honest accounting of where your energy went during the preceding days. Which expenditures aligned with what genuinely matters to you? Which were habitual or reflexive in ways you would not have chosen with more awareness? What did not receive your full presence because your presence was already spent elsewhere on something less worthy of it? The goal is not a perfect score or the discovery of how badly you managed yourself. The goal is information. The same information a navigator uses to correct course before the drift becomes significant. Seneca recommended examining each day before it concluded, not to produce guilt, but to produce clarity. The examined day informs the next one. The unexamined day simply accumulates its patterns invisibly until the cumulative weight of those patterns becomes impossible to ignore. By that point, correction requires considerably more effort than it would have required when the drift was still small. There is a practical truth that the philosophy consistently points toward. but that requires direct experience to fully trust. Protecting your energy does not diminish your engagement with life. It deepens it. The conversations you choose to enter with your full presence, having declined others that would have cost you without return, are conversations in which something genuinely real is exchanged. The work you bring your clearest attention to, having protected that attention from diffuse expenditure across obligations that arrived demanding it before you evaluated them, produces outcomes your depleted self could not have reached. The person managing their energy deliberately is not giving less to the world. They are giving better to the world. The quality of presence they bring to what they have genuinely chosen, the relationships they have committed to, the work they have decided matters, the creative endeavors they have elected to pursue, is qualitatively richer, more attentive, more capable of producing real impact. You cannot achieve that quality of presence when your available energy has already been spread thin across obligations that received it by default rather than by decision. This is where Stoic philosophy and practical effectiveness meet most directly. The philosophy does not ask you to stop caring about outcomes. It asks you to care enough about outcomes to protect the instrument through which those outcomes are produced: your mind, your judgment, your capacity for sustained, focused attention. These are the means. Everything you wish to build, everything you wish to offer, everything you wish to become, all of it flows from these means, and the means require care. What are you actually building with your life? And is the way you currently allocate your presence genuinely in service of that, or in service of 100 other demands that arrived before you had decided whether they deserved it? Let us speak finally about what it feels like to live this way from the inside, not as a destination you eventually reach, but as a practice you sustain imperfectly and improve gradually over the entire course of a life. There will be days when the automatic yes emerges before you had time to pause, when the drain has already occurred before the awareness arrived to prevent it. These are not failures, they are part of the process, and more importantly, they are information. What triggered the reflex? What in that particular moment bypassed the space between stimulus and response? What can be prepared differently so that next time, the pause is available? The Stoic approach to personal development was never perfection. It was honest improvement through disciplined observation. And Marcus Aurelius recorded in his private journal not his triumphs, but his stumbles. Moments of impatience, of reactive judgment, of falling short of the standard he held himself to. He recorded them not in shame, but in the spirit of a philosopher who was still actively learning from his own lived experience. His commitment was not to being perfect. It was to continuing to look, to examine, to choose, even imperfectly and even repeatedly. That is the posture available to every person willing to take it. Not mastery delivered complete and final, but mastery under consistent construction. The daily practice of noticing where presence went, whether it was given deliberately or surrendered by reflex, and of course correcting with neither drama nor excessive self-criticism. Simply, I see what happened there. I understand it better now. I will be more attentive in the next opportunity. Across weeks and months, this practice produces something genuinely remarkable, a new baseline. Not the depleted baseline that habitual overextension creates, but a baseline of relative clarity and interior stability. The background noise of anxiety and imagined obligation decreases, not because the world has changed, but because your relationship to it has, because you have taken up consistent residence in the part of yourself that observes and chooses, rather than the part that merely reacts. From that place of relative clarity, something becomes possible that exhaustion makes entirely inaccessible. real discernment about what actually matters. The tired mind cannot hold priorities clearly. It cannot distinguish between what is genuinely urgent and what merely feels so because it arrived loudly. It cannot maintain a long view or hold complexity without collapsing it. The mind that is protected, rested, and deliberately managed operates entirely differently. It sees further. It can hold multiple considerations at once without being overwhelmed. Its choices reflect actual values rather than immediate pressure. This is what the Stoics meant by living according to reason, not cold, detached computation, but the kind of grounded, clear judgment that only becomes available when the mind is not overwhelmed by depletion and reactivity. The same circumstances that feel insurmountable when you are running empty often feel navigable when you are genuinely present. The obstacles have not changed. Your capacity to meet them has. There is a cultural dimension here that deserves honest acknowledgement. The broader environment most of us inhabit does not support what is being described. It celebrates busyness as a signal of importance. It equates exhaustion with dedication and devotion. It treats the person who clearly declines as suspect and the person who never stops as admirable. These stories are not neutral. They actively undermine the kind of deliberate energy management the Stoics advocated. And they are not simply inconvenient, they are wrong. Being perpetually busy is not the same as being genuinely purposeful. Exhaustion is not evidence of devotion. Unlimited availability is not the same as generosity. These conflations serve systems and structures that benefit from your unlimited output, not you, not the people you care about, not the work you are trying to do well. The Stoic counternarrative is quiet and radical at once. The life well lived is not the one that produced the most, accommodated the most requests, or received the most external recognition. It is the life in which the inner person remained sovereign, present, clear, genuinely chosen. That sovereignty is precisely what you are exercising when you pause before saying yes, when you choose genuine rest over one more hour of output, when you leave a conversation that has nothing real to offer, when you decline an obligation that conflicts with something that genuinely matters to you. These are not acts of selfishness. They are acts of self-governance. The only governance the Stoics believed any person is truly equipped to perform, and the kind that makes every other kind of contribution possible. We live in a world that generates noise at a scale entirely unprecedented in human history. Not just external noise, though the volume of that is staggering, but internal noise amplified by constant, uninterrupted input. The quiet required for genuine reflection, for the kind of honest self-examination that produces real and lasting change, is not automatically available anywhere in the modern context. It must be created, protected, returned to deliberately, repeatedly, because the forces drawing you away from it are persistent and structural. The Stoic practices of morning preparation, evening reflection, and midday pause were technologies for creating that quiet in a world that was, even then, dense with demands and distractions. These practices are not historical curiosities. They are not elegant but impractical philosophy. They remain available. They remain effective. And choosing them now requires the same quality the Stoics admired most: the willingness to act according to your own considered judgment, rather than the default direction of the surrounding current. You do not have to announce this choice. You do not have to explain or defend it, or seek approval for it from anyone. You simply have to make it again and again in the accumulation of small daily moments where it becomes available. The pause before the yes. The morning 10 minutes before the first notification. The brief, honest inventory at the end of the day. These are not grand gestures. They are the actual material of a life lived deliberately rather than reactively. Accumulated over time, these practices produce a life that looks quietly, be substantially different from the one produced by unexamined living, not necessarily more dramatic in its visible achievements, but more coherent, more genuinely aligned with what you actually care about, more authentically yours. A life in which the things that matter receive your real presence, rather than whatever remained after the world helped itself to everything it could reach. Before we close, I want to bring this back to something you can carry with you into the next hour, not as an abstract idea, but as a usable practice. The next time any request arrives, large or small, from someone close to you or from a relative stranger, try this. Before you answer, place a single deliberate breath between the stimulus and your response. That breath is the pause. In that pause, ask yourself one honest question. Am I moving toward yes because I genuinely want to give this my presence, or because something in me is already complying before I have decided? You do not need to make this complicated. You do not need a long internal negotiation or a philosophical framework deployed in real time. You just need that one breath, that one moment of genuine consideration before the answer exits. Over time, that breath becomes natural, the first instinctive movement of a mind that has learned to own its responses rather than simply produce them on demand. This is not a destination, it is a direction. Every step in this direction, however imperfect, however frequently interrupted by the old habits, is a genuine step toward the life the Stoics described as free. Not free from difficulty, not free from obligation or demand, but free in the only way that ultimately matters, sovereign within, present to what you have chosen, deliberate, grounded, and finally genuinely your own. Peace is not found by escaping the world, it is found by governing yourself within it. If this way of thinking opened something in you, if even one part of it landed somewhere real, then do the thing that matters most. Keep going. Subscribe to Stoic Sight if you have not yet, and hit like so this conversation finds other people who need it. Every video on this channel is built for exactly the kind of person who stayed with this one. Someone who suspects that the quality of their inner life is a choice, and who is ready to take that choice seriously. The next video goes deeper into the specific daily practices the Stoics actually used, and how they translate into measurable, practical change. It is there when you are ready, and carry one thing with you from this. Your energy is not the world's resource, it is yours. The way you protect it, allocate it, and deliberately direct it will determine not merely how you feel tomorrow morning, but what you are genuinely capable of offering to your work, your relationships, and everything you are still in the process of building. That is not a small matter. That is the whole matter. Guard it accordingly.